The ever-elusive airbrush. A powerful hobby tool that some people consider too much trouble to be worth it. But me, I love my airbrush. Not only does it allow me to prime my miniatures inside, but it's really great at throwing down smooth gradients and easy base coats. I do totally understand that it's kind of a fickle thing and kind of tricky to use, especially if you're just starting out. I think one of the main things that turns people off is the cleaning and the maintenance. And that's kind of a bummer because I actually think it's pretty easy to keep your airbrush clean and in working condition. And I'm by no means an expert, but after using my airbrush for a couple of years, I've sort of figured out a easy little cleaning routine that I do after I'm done painting that really keeps the headache out of airbrushing and instead lets me focus on the hobbying. Keeping your airbrush clean actually starts while you're using it, making sure that you're using the right technique. And this is actually something that took me way too long to figure out. If you're using a dual action airbrush, when you go to spray, the first thing you want to do is press down on your trigger to start the airflow, and then start pulling back to spray paint. When you're done, push the trigger and needle forward, and only then lift your finger up, turning off the air. Moving the trigger backwards drags the needle back. If you do this without the airflow turned on, when you pull that needle back, you're actually dragging some of the paint back with it into the barrel of the airbrush where it can get stuck, dry, and create a clog. Instead, by having the air on, we'll make sure that when we pull the needle back, paint is shooting through the airbrush out the nozzle and only going where it should be. Another tip for airbrushing is that you actually hardly need to move the trigger back to get good paint flow. If you're going for large coverage or base coats, you might need to open it up a bit, but for smooth gradients and everything else, it's really best to go slow. Airbrushing is an additive process where you're building up layers of color. You can always add more, and you'd be surprised at how little you need to move the trigger back. And now that we've covered some preventative measures, let's talk about cleaning. While airbrushing, I usually gather these supplies. I start off with the cardboard box that I airbrush into, which I think is a great thing to bring up, that you don't need a really fancy setup in order to airbrush. I mean, look at me, I'm just a guy with a cardboard box. Really all I do is open up my windows, run an air purifier, wear my respirator, and I'm all set. Then I grab my airbrush cleaner, an old pickle jar with water in it appropriately labeled that I spray excess cleaner into, then a dry palette that holds my cleaner. I also use an old dropper paint bottle filled with just water, and then I grab an old paintbrush I don't mind damaging, as well as a small piece of foam. This is like from those big puzzle piece edged pieces of foam that you often see for like karate or gym flooring. It's got a bit of squish to it, but pretty firm. And of course, the airbrush and some paper towels. Not pictured is also my regular paint water holder. And then for this video, I'm going to be using Vallejo's black surface primer. I always hear things about how much it clogs up airbrushes and is tricky to clean, so I figured it'd make for a good demonstration. As part of my setup while airbrushing, I take my airbrush cleaner and pour some into the dry palette so I have easy access to it while airbrushing. Quite often while painting, you might experience something known as dry tip. This is when paint dries on the tip of the needle, ruining the flow of the paint. What I like to do is take my brush, dip it into the cleaner, and saturate the dry paint, often putting the needle tip right into the belly of the bristles. Then I put the brush into my water cup, rinsing it off. This removes a good amount of the dry paint, but to really get it off, I then take that small piece of foam, press the needle tip right into it, and squeeze the foam, squeegeeing or pinching off the dry paint. Then I use the angles cut into the foam to help remove any excess from around the nozzle and get into those harder to reach areas. Then I make sure to blow away the cleaner liquid left on the nozzle by giving it just a few quick bursts off to the side before I move on to my model. And I'm using a Badger Patriot airbrush, which has that open nozzle tip design. I still think keeping cleaner on hand to remove dry tip is useful though if you have a different airbrush design. And using a brush, you should be able to get to it pretty easily. I do know that sometimes other artists keep a rag with cleaner on it handy to just wipe the dry tip off if the foam doesn't work for you. Once you're done airbrushing and it's time to clean up, I take some paper towel and dip it into my cleaner and use it to wipe down the inside of the paint cup, really focusing on breaking down some of the paint that may have dried on the sides and cleaning that up. Then I take my dropper bottle full of water and squirt some into the paint cup. At first, this might be pretty full of paint, so you can just dump it out into your water cup, but as soon as it becomes more clear, I like to get in there with my brush and work it into the bottom of the airbrush cup, trying to dislodge all the paint I can. Swirling it around and trying to reach down into the area that the paint sits in and getting around the needle. Then I dump the paint out into my water cup. I repeat these steps, squirt in some water, stir it around with my brush, and dumping it out, until all I'm seeing in the airbrush paint cup is basically water. You'll notice while doing this that you might unearth some dried up bits of paint or little flecks, and this is actually why we're dumping all of this into our water cup. We're trying to avoid it getting into the nozzle where it could become a much bigger problem. Once the water is basically clear, it's time to repeat this step, but now with a bit of cleaner. A little bit goes a long way, and you can even add water if you're worried about the amount of liquid in there. But we're going to add some cleaner and again swirl it around with our brush, trying to clean it all out and get to all the paint. You can see that even though it was pretty clear with just water, the addition of the cleaner helps to get out hopefully the last bit of paint that's in there. You can repeat this step with cleaner if you want, but I just used a bit of water to try and flush out the last of what's in there. Then I use paper towel to wipe out the last of any dried paint and use my dropper bottle to help flush off any watery paint from the outside of my airbrush. And now we're sort of on the final stage of cleaning. Most of the paint should be out of the airbrush, and now we're going to spray some cleaner through it. And you can see I've switched out my water cup for the pickle jar. I add some cleaner to my paint cup as well as a little bit of water and swirl around my brush, attempting to get any last bits of paint, but also making sure there's no dried bits of paint. If you see anything like that, you should dump it out instead of spraying it through the nozzle. Also, if you're worried that you got some paint up into the barrel of the airbrush while painting, you can pull back on the trigger, working some of the cleaner into it. But this also has the potential to introduce any dried bits of paint that you've dislodged from the main paint cup, so it's up to you. And from here, we just tilt the pickle jar and dip the airbrush nozzle into the liquid so it's submerged and spray the cleaner through. You want enough water in the pickle jar so you can easily stick the nozzle underwater, but know that there's going to be bubbles, so if it's too full, they might start spilling out. I repeat this step a couple times, squirting cleaner into the airbrush cup and spraying it through, making sure the liquid is clear and there's no paint. Once done, I use my dropper bottle to wash off any bubbles or whatever is on the outside of my airbrush. If you really want to do a deeper clean or are looking to really quickly swap colors, you can submerge the airbrush until the entire paint cup is underwater. This allows it to continuously flow in water from the jar, letting you keep spraying. This is nice if you have some cleaner in there, as it's cycling in cleaner fluid and shooting it out. You definitely want to make sure the liquid in the pickle jar is devoid of anything that could cause a clog though, and I think that this isn't totally necessary. If you have a dedicated hobby space, you can just keep a little bit of cleaner in your airbrush paint cup, but I like to just let a little bit sit in there for about 20 minutes just to make sure I got everything that I can. Then later I check and spray out the remainder of the cleaner, wipe out the cup and leave it to dry. And that's it. Typically, this is all the cleaning you have to do to make sure your airbrush is in ship shape and ready to spray for the next session. Once dry though, you might notice a tiny bit of sticking, and for this, I remove the needle, put some cleaner on a paper towel, and wipe off all the dried paint I can see on there. This takes care of like 90% of all the problems I have, and typically this is all the cleaning that I do. However, sometimes there are more extreme cases, especially with something tricky like this primer. If cleaning the needle didn't do the trick, it's time for a deeper clean. I also try to make this as easy for myself as possible, so I disassemble my airbrush except for the front half. So basically I just have the main body with the nozzle still intact, as usually this is the only bit that should be involved with the paint. I place this in a spare container and pour in a splash of cleaner. This stuff is actually pretty strong and can be diluted quite a bit, so I just fill the rest of the container up with water, making sure to cover the airbrush. If there's a little bit sticking out, it can actually collect minerals and stuff from your water as it evaporates, so it's good to make sure that it's covered. And just after about 5 minutes of soaking, I am able to go in there and push out the clog, making sure I don't get it into the nozzle and instead pour it out of the cup. I can't really recommend doing this with your airbrush needle as they're fragile and should be treated preciously, but I've perhaps dropped mine before, so I'm not too worried about it, but an old needle would be great for this, or there's lots of different cleaning tools available. If you're worried, you can just skip this part though and let your airbrush continue to soak in the cleaner. And you can see after just about 20 minutes or so how many bits of dried paint have emerged from the airbrush. How long you leave your airbrush in there is up to you, but I think anything over a couple hours is probably overkill. From here, I remove my airbrush, making sure to dump out any of those dried bits and rinse it out and then leave it to dry. Once dry, it's time to reassemble it and get it ready for the next painting session. Like I said, this cleaning method is something I find super simple and easy and allows me to kind of keep the headache out of cleaning my airbrush and instead focus on the painting. I hope this kind of demystifies airbrush use and cleaning and shows that it's pretty approachable with just a couple steps to flush out the airbrush at the end of a painting session or between colors. And this is usually all I have to do, especially when painting with regular paint. Sometimes after priming I need to soak my airbrush like I showed, but even that is rare. If you need something tougher, I've heard great things about lacquer thinner, but I haven't really found it necessary yet. And this is just my cleaning process. I'm sure you'll find ways to tweak it and make it your own, but I really like how effective and also really simple and straightforward it is, hopefully taking some of the pressure off of airbrushing and allowing people to just enjoy this really powerful and fun hobby tool. Thanks for watching.